this room with all of you and to see everybody just looking so wonderfully resplendent. I don't know about how many of you spent the last 2 years being smart for the top half only, but that was very much a characteristic of my Zoom and team life. So it was really nice to be dressed up tonight. We're also going to move on and have a fantastic dinner shortly, but we really wanted to emphasize that at the heart of the OII's community is our academic life. And so we wanted to begin the evening with a chance to show off our newest associate professor. Many of you might not even have met her in the flesh. She's not been teaching yet. She only joined us in March. But Katya Hertog is a really fantastic sociologist. She's got such an interesting background. I mean, I've always thought that one of the great things about the OII is that we draw people in from such incredibly different disciplines. Katya is by background a sociologist, but she was also a sociologist of Japan. So she brings expertise of a part of the world that not many of us cover. She spent a lot of her time working on issues around the sociology of the family, looking at issues around gender, and now her research has turned towards obviously the study of AI and technology that focuses very much on domestic labour, the home and the family. That's what she's going to speak about tonight. So I think we've got around about half an hour you'll speak for. We've definitely got some time for Q&A before the drinks reception. Those of you who are watching online, hopefully in the seminar room, I hope that's working very well. I'm sorry you probably can't ask questions directly, but we'll have a chance to talk more about this with all of us later on. So with that, over to you, Katya. Thank you very much for starting the scene.
Thank you very much. I feel I peaked at this point. So anyway, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks a lot for this very generous introduction. I'm really excited. As Vicky said, I've only joined the OII on the 1st of March, and it seemed like almost immediately Easter break was upon us. So I met a few people and I had brilliant conversations, worked together with a couple of people, but I still feel there's so many more people to meet. And I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk about my work and my research. And I hope afterwards, please reach out that we'll have more possibilities for those who are not in the room, for example, to chat, or for those who are in the room as well. So I thought that before I go into my academic presentation to the paper, I'll just say a few words broadly about my research interests and introduce my big research project that I have. I work with two collaborators here at OII, the brilliant Lulu Shi, and I don't see Willy, but he's somewhere around, I think. So these are my two collaborators here, but I'm looking forward to spreading and talking to more of you and discussing research. So as Vicky said, my broad interest in technology started with interest in automation of domestic work. I lead this project that we call shortly Domestic AI, but essentially it was initially conceived as a parallel to the future of work literature. I mean, all of you here are familiar with that literature. Basically, at the core of it is the idea that at some point robots are going to take over some of the jobs, which jobs will disappear, what the consequences will be for the society. Well, we thought, well, if robots are stealing our jobs, could they maybe also take out our trash? What about the laundry? Cooking, anyone? So, and I think spending a year chat with two primary school aged kids in 2020 really brought this home. I needed that robot. So we started thinking, well, what about the future of unpaid work? And as there hasn't been much work done of this, together with Lulu and Willy, we've done an expert survey asking experts what do they think is the future of domestic automation, which domestic tasks might be automated in the near future. And we're now about to field the survey on sort of consequences. Would people think it's acceptable? Is it fine if a robot washes my floor? What about if the robot takes care of my baby? Is that still all right? What do we think about that? So I'm looking forward to having more conversations, collaborations, challenges on this topic. And this is just to show how important we think this is. This is a graph that this just collates figures published annually by the International Federation of Robotics. The categorization of robots is very much as proposed by them. They divide robots into 4 categories, and the red ones are the household service robots, which are largely various Roomba iterations, washing floor, I think they're called slightly differently, and lawnmowers. And then they've got household entertainment robots, professional service robots, and industrial robots. As we can see, at least in terms of numbers of computational units, household service robots were the majority, sort of they outstripped all other types of robots as early as 2010. That's the earliest figures we can get hold of. And in more recent years, this just exploded. And that's before the pandemic. I wonder what's happening since 2020. So this is just to say that while my project very much sort of looks at the future of unpaid work, some of it is already here. Domestic work is being automated. And this figure doesn't cover things like voice assistants, which can take over some other tasks and are very common already. And that links to this other paper, which is under the broad umbrella of digitalization of the home. So this is a paper co-authored with Elizabeth Fetterolf, who is at the Social Media Collective. And it aims to see how sort of young adult Amazon Alexa users make sense of sort of an experience using Alexa in the home, and what do they think about it. And first of all, as I already said, domestic automation is these computational units, digitalization of the home is getting ever more common. The top two figures, I think all of us are familiar with. Some of us own those. I think it's a Google Nest and sort of some generic Alexa cylinder image. At the bottom, we have Amazon Ring drone and Amazon Astro. These two sort of new devices were announced with much fanfare by Amazon some point last year. I don't think they're at all that common, but they again represent the push of Amazon at home. These things now can follow you and I think watch you through cameras or watch visitors through cameras in the home as well. Exciting. So Amazon and Google are very much the two companies who are at the forefront of the sort of smart home, or trying to make home smart as much as possible, which is why we decided to pick one of the two companies as our case study. And our core interest is the collision between public and private. While any smart home ad, at least any smart home ad I see, sort of conceptualizes the home as this oasis. I mean, we have this digital smart kind of thing, but otherwise it's a quiet place where I'm with my significant other. It's away from the market and so on. But actually, as many researchers have noted, bringing digital devices, bringing voice assistants in our homes, and I like this sort of term used by Malson and Sadowski in 2019, makes finance, real estate, insurance, homes, basically our roommates as these companies get access to the data collected by those voice assistants. So while it might be sort of this presented as this calm, peaceful, very domestic oasis, actually it collects data and sends it to the third parties. And there's a conflict of interest, and what do people think about it? Again, this is probably the last setting the scene slide. They are very common. I just pulled these are screenshots from VoiceBot AI. Annotated here at the bottom. It's just a private company which produces various sort of news reports and market analytics, and they specifically focus on voice assistants, and the two core spheres are smart homes and cars. And what I find interesting in these figures is I think they record the rapid spread of these things. These are just numbers of voice assistant bases in homes installed in the US, UK, and Germany. And in the US, we can see that between 2018 and 2021, the numbers of these bases more than doubled. And if we compare it to the number of US adults, that almost, if we assume that one adult wouldn't own more than one of those bases, which is not necessarily the case, but could be, then about a third of them, about a third of adults have an Echo Dot or some equivalent of that. The proportion is quite similar in the UK. I think it's even over a third. In Germany, it's less than a third, closer to a quarter, but it's big, substantial numbers in all these countries. So, well, as I said, bringing these digital tools, voice assistants that collect that could collect our private data into the homes, brings about an interesting paradox. And particular technology companies historically nurtured high levels of information asymmetry. I think for a long time we didn't really know. I think Google is a case in point. We didn't really know how much data it collects. I mean, many people were not really aware that it trolls through emails, for example, and so on. And it was kept under wraps for a very long time. I mean, there's more information, more awareness of it now. And I think partially as a result of this sort of historical, huge informational asymmetry, there's a high levels of public distrust. If any sort of survey I've looked at, or at least in the Western countries, the countries outside the European and Anglophone sphere are a little bit different in that, respect. But at least in Europe and the US, on the measures, people generally think that big tech is not necessarily trustworthy. Companies should not be led to manage private data and so on. So there seems to be generally, at least through the surveys, documented high levels of distrust. And yet, at the same time, we have this explosion, if we look at the voice assistants, explosion of these bots brought into private homes. Again, we thought Amazon is a good case study because particularly these are some screenshots of recent news related to Amazon, highlighting, for example, that the Amazon warehouse workers get injured a lot more often than other warehouse workers in comparable jobs, or that Jeff Bezos and his company don't really pay very much taxes. I think they were also their anti-unionization drives attracted a lot of attention. So the news on Amazon are often not particularly positive. So again, we thought that would, on the one hand, Alexa is a very common, is the most common, I think, voice assistant in private homes. They are expanding rapidly. At the same time, there's probably, people don't tend not to particularly like Amazon. And when we see Amazon in the news often not very good. So existing literature came up with some solutions for the privacy paradox. Many of the solutions focus on the individuals. So one, for example, is, they're all interesting and I think explain, at least they are part of the story. So not all of these papers or books in some cases are on Amazon. For example, the first one, this is 2016 book by Neff and Nafos, which is on self-tracking, so Fitbits and the like. Somewhere they make an argument that, well, for the first time, the self-tracking devices collect information about us. Users are interested, they get those insights into themselves, their sleep patterns, exercise patterns, and so on, and they're willing to exchange. So it's a willing exchange. It's a sort of, they get some benefit out of it, and at least within themselves, they make a calculation that this is worth it, give up some private data, get these interesting insights. I haven't seen it in the literature, but I've seen in the media, I think, an argument being made that Amazon is pushing into private homes, trying to push on the back of fear that I think it purchased Ring, I think. So now that it promises household security. If there is an intruder, this Ring drone, I'm not sure what it's going to do, but they will do something and we'll feel all much safer as a result. So again, there is an exchange, there's a benefit, it's greatest safety of my home, and I will give up all this private data to Amazon. Another argument is just lack of awareness. There's some papers, usually based on surveys, saying that the users of voice assistants and other sort of people more willing to give up private data, who are just less aware. They don't care, they don't have full sort of picture, and that's the reason why. So people who are more aware would not would make their choices differently. Finally, there's a more nuanced argument, first I think proposed by Draper and Turo in 2019, which is digital resignation. And they argue that, well, these days there's ever more of these devices, our data, people are aware that their data is being collected, then they're not necessarily welcoming it, but they see no escape. They think there's nothing they can do about it, therefore let's just give up and go on with our lives. Well, I think all of the solutions potentially could be part of the explanation. There is an important, I think they're missing part of the puzzle, and they all focus on sort of individuals and individual choices. But if we look at the sort of companies and research looking at voice assistants from the perspectives of from the companies and interviewing company experts and so on, there's a lot going on about how human-like these things have become, anthropomorphization, and there's research that shows that people are more likely to trust digital devices and gadgets if they have some human features, which is why I think often they have eyes and smile or be sad. And Amazon in particular, all of these images, I don't know how well you can see them, but they're screenshots from recent Amazon ads where these humans, they're Alexa. I find this the most interesting, and it's the least visible simultaneously. It's a picture of a domestic service, and I think the ad is called "Before Alexa." This is what we had to do, and they basically draw a line. I mean, they highlight the servile nature of Alexa. Alexa is now replacing a domestic service. They're making this leap. This is what Alexa is. It's our servant. And also, again, historically, until very recently, most of these voice assistants had a default female voices or even only female voices, again, highlighting how non-threatening they are. And again, earlier, mostly were female actresses representing Alexa. More recently, now there is this also gorgeous guy as well. So, so this is not quite the case anymore. But I think that, again, researchers highlight the fact that often there's a parallel to Alexa is our voice assistant, a smart wife or a secretary, a servile, non-threatening, often female being. So, well, if people's enthusiasm or use of these devices can be well explained by either the benefits that they gather or the fact that they've given up or they don't care, why do we need to also show how non-threatening and helpful and servile these things are? We also, looking at the research, much of the arguments from the individual side or perspectives on user experiences are either based on surveys or sort of questionnaires. So there's not much continuity, or users are not really observed, or they don't get to talk about they use in greater details often. I haven't seen a detailed ethnography, for example, specifically looking at the practices. So this is where we thought we can contribute. This paper is based on 9 months of field work. As you can see, it was in the middle of the pandemic. So it was a lot of virtual conversations about experiences with people. Alexa, I mean, this field work was carried out by Elizabeth, not done by me. I think being a young American adult, she also spoke to her friends. There was some participant observation with humans in real life, with Alexa user in real life. All the interviews were carried out virtually. We decided to focus on childless individuals at young, sort of between early 20s to early 30s. The reason we narrowed down the sample quite a bit is, first of all, we know, again, from the literature and from the media that families with children tend to use their voice assistants somewhat differently. All the people generally, again, from the literature and from the surveys, they interact with their voice assistants differently. So we thought in a qualitative study, it would be useful to narrow down to sort of more to some like homogeneous group. It was not intentional, but all of them have college education. So that is a disclaimer. They're also higher educated than average. And we recruited them via social media and then snowballing. So we wanted to have more than one point, so we don't end up with a network of friends, Alexa users with the particular practices and norms. But once we had several, I think 4 or 5 entry points, we were quite happy to interview people's friends as well. And having lengthy conversation about their use of their voice assistant and their practices enabled us also to observe how people relate to that continuously and to see whether the way they think about Alexa and the kind of qualities, do they think of it as a machine-like or more as a human-like? Is it quite stable and continuous? Have they made up their mind once and for all, this is a machine, or this is more like a human and a friend or not? So we haven't seen that done, and we thought that was quite, and then it enabled us a new viewpoint onto Alexa users. So first, before this slide actually, what we didn't find any evidence that people not caring. That of course could be partially the fact that they're young and they're well-educated, relatively well-educated as well. So all of them were very much aware of their data being collected. All of them were aware of Amazon as a company. They didn't have, I think apart from one person, they either majority, although it's a small sample, so but just broadly speaking, most of them had quite negative views of Amazon. Some of them were more ambiguous. Only one person was really positive and thought it was really great. It's a really great company. They were aware of their data being collected. So there's evidence that the users don't know, don't care, don't realize what's happening. We didn't find any evidence of that in this. We did find a fair amount of evidence of digital resignation. So there are a couple of quotes from our interviewees. I think the general pattern was that they all pointed out broadly to ubiquity of data collection, and they highlighted, they were basically saying that Alexa per se is not a problem. My phone, my TV, everything is listening to me. So it's sort of pointless to switch on just this one gadget, and I can't really give up everything else. So I picked up a couple of, I think Jonathan was particularly, expressed himself particularly nicely, saying it's everywhere. I mean, that's referring to private data and data collection. The data is owned, bought, sold, traded, and bid for. This seems very obvious. And then he adds, clarifies, she, Alexa, doesn't feel particularly a problem. That's really it. She's just another arm of a general problem. So it's just a small, he's conceptualizing Alexis, just a small sort of part of the pattern. And he sees a general pattern as a problem, but doesn't really see a good way of interacting or sort of resisting it. Another, Lucia says, I'm pretty sure my phone is doing everything also, and she's an iPhone owner. I imagine it's not much different, like Apple and Amazon. I imagine they're both ruthless. So people generally don't think highly of big tech and feel they cannot quite resist this digital surveillance. Another thing that we found is that this pattern was not, I wouldn't say not stable, but it wasn't that the person just kind of gave up and said, well, there's no point talking about this data collection. Let's talk about something else more interesting. They clearly wrestled with it. So sometimes they were talking about how Amazon is not a good company and is collecting everything. And then I picked up another quote from Jonathan at a later point. He doesn't like Amazon. He thinks it's a bad company. And so like in this household, we hate Jeff Bezos, but we separate Alexa from Jeff Bezos. So Elizabeth saying, oh, okay, both laugh. That makes a lot of sense. And then Jonathan emphatically adds, it's not her fault. So we found this was a very, very widespread pattern. Overall, we found an instability of pronouns. So this is something that is difficult to observe with a survey where people are just asked, do you refer to Alexa as an it or a he or a she? So, or do you think Alexa has emotions or something like that? But when people talk about the Amazon, they kept switching between the two. Sometimes it was an it, and often then it was connected. They referred them back to the company. She is not listening, they are. So separating the two and then going to this more, so that it's the bad Amazon company, but Alexa is just, is quite different. And that was, with this finding, we've drawn a parallel to the literature. There's a sociological literature, and big literature on trust, and in particular, trusting the untrustworthy. Much of this literature is medical sociology, and it often deals with the cases, not only, but deals with the cases where, for example, people are sick patients who need to take medicine, and they have no way to establish if that medicine is fake or it's a real medicine. So then, how do they navigate that situation? This is a colleague of mine in Oxford sociology, for example. It's one of the African countries with a lot of fake medicines who look pretty genuine. And there's no way, unless you put these pills in the lab, to tell whether there's a good pill or a bad pill. And the way people navigate this conundrum, I mean, it's very stressful. And what they do is they try to establish a relationship with their pharmacists, for example, to sort of hopeful that there is an informational asymmetry there at the low end. They don't have the information and they can't gather it, but they hope that sort of they establish a relationship with their pharmacist, and then the pharmacist maybe is going to give them better drugs, or sort of give them some clues towards maybe buy this one, but not that one. And we thought there's perhaps some parallel going on here. So people, one of the solutions that people found in this fairly stressful situation where they didn't like Amazon, but they chose to use Alexa. They're not quite, there's a difference there with the patients, because they are genuinely sick and they have to use it. These people did not have to use Alexa. Presumably they could give up on that, but they were aware generally of the data being collected. They chose to use Alexa in their homes. And one way that they seem to navigate it is to humanize it and to almost try to establish a relationship with it. And perhaps then Alexa will not let Jeff Bezos listen in, or just sort of be more benign and behave better. We're not arguing that this is what consciously is going on, but there was an interesting sort of constant switching between the evil it mechanical thing that's an arm of a they, a bad company, versus she, and it's not her fault, and she's doing her best. Finally, there was these people were very able to actually efficiently, effectively stop Amazon from collecting their data. So we had a couple of cases. These were a minority, but the people were drawn occasionally to draw the line and to switch it off or to move it away from a particular space. But these were only taken, these steps were taken in very particular situations. A very common one, that certain rooms were out of bounds because people were not quite familiar. They didn't fully realize how Alexa works, when is it switching off, when it switching on, when off. They generally assume that it's just listening all the time. I think that's not what the manual says, but that was the basic assumption, that it's a listening device. So they wouldn't want it in the shower or bathroom. Some of them considered it, like Tanya here, but generally that was a no-no. So that was the line drawn that couldn't be put in the bathrooms. Another case when the users felt that the conversations they were having, or they were going through, Michelle was going through a very rough patch in her relationship, and they had a lot of fights with her boyfriend, and she said we were having like a hard patch in our relationship at one point, and I didn't feel comfortable talking about that with echo on. And that was like the only time that we really did that. And she refers to switching it off. They just switched the thing off. And once the relationship sort of repaired or balanced itself out, they had it back on again. But finally, 2 users were really put off by the ads. I think that's when Amazon, then they couldn't kind of think of Alexa as a different being that is maybe almost a human being, but something. When Alexa started giving them ads, like Leo says, I don't want ads, not in my house. We get, honestly, like if it can sit there and listen to me, that's fine. If it started doing that, showing ads more often, that would be the end of it. So he was really put off by once Alexa sort of piping up and saying, do you know that they can sell you that? And he was talking about potentially getting rid of it because it did that. So what are sort of our conclusions or thoughts based on that? Well, people generally seem pessimistic about digital surveillance. They assume the worst, potentially even worse than what the companies promise to do. I think Alexa is supposed to only switch on if you call it and then record for some seconds and switch off again. We've asked users about that. None of them was aware of this, that's what the manual says. And they basically didn't believe it when Elizabeth said, well, this is what Amazon says that it's doing. It's like, no, it's listening all the time. There is attention, anxiety, and evidence of conflict that people think about, and they come up with solutions for it. And what we think is interesting and problematic at the same time, we could broadly divide the solutions into sort of accepting, giving up. One is just digital resignation, and another is reconceptualizing Alexa in a new way. I mean, it helps to solve, it helped them to solve the anxiety, to address the psychological problem. It did not in any way disrupt Amazon's data collection, whatever it was doing. It didn't interfere with Amazon's bottom line, wouldn't have any consequences of it. And these were by far the more popular choices. Users were aware and very able to disrupt this bottom line. They were able to resist data collection by moving it, switching it off, and draw a line, but that was a much rarer, rarer occurrence. So, I mean, it seems that most individual solutions do not disrupt Amazon's data collection. So then what are we haven't got much beyond that, but I think this is interesting to think about, and whether we actually need to have something, or to prompt people, or to sort of remind them that this is not a human. I don't know if Amazon, if Alexa once a day said, this is Jeff Bezos listening to you, people might feel more cautious about it. So whether this is something that's desirable, I'm not so sure. So that's a paper, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments, questions, and criticisms. We haven't submitted it yet. We are planning in the next 3 weeks or so. So now is a good time. I can still correct it.
questions before we break the drinks? I'm going to ask the questions a lot. I'm hoping some other people will have some for you. What's this? This is.
It's a microphone. I'll just leave it here.
Carefully identified. Not described as a microphone, but I'll take your word for it. One thing I did want to just pick up on, perhaps before anybody else comes in, is just those last comments you were making about what really is a really insidious nature actually of these voice assistants. And I wondered, how much of this you thought was actually also just down to the way they're designed. So for example, we are very used, I think, to screen-based technologies with the concept that particular sort of text and video information, image information is data that is being transferred and probably utilized. But with a screenless technology, it just sits and lurks in the background. So I guess I wondered how much of this do you think that could be solved by more transparent forms of design?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what would be the transparent formula. I think exactly you're picking on a very important point that these voice assistants, and we are a voice, especially if it sounds very human-like, it's quite easy to sort of not pay attention to and not, it doesn't kind of come up with, do you agree to cookies and other kind of helpful prompts that do appear on the screen. So I think that is very much part of the problem, and it would be useful to have some kind of reminder, less human-like voice. I mean, probably people will find it extremely annoying, but if it talked like a robot.
Well, I'm sure it's deliberate. I'm sure that
yes,
the companies who make these know they could design them in this way and choose not to. Okay, other people, questions or comments? Right, I'm going to come to faculty in a minute. Clemmy, I think.
Thank you so much, Katya. That was so interesting. And yeah, I guess my question is about the sample. So just why you chose to look at 20 to 30-year-old childless individuals, and also how you think, to what extent you think that therefore comments on like the general population of people who are using this kind of tech.
So it's a qualitative design. We cannot comment on the general population in any way. So I mean, as is common in qualitative design with small samples, it's a sort of, it's a test case. So if you pick, we thought that if we pick young people, I mean, they also usually or urban and they happen to be well educated, this is going to be, if anyone's able to resist this technology, it's more likely to be these people. So we thought that that's why we picked on them. They're like the red herring. If these guys cannot, then I just feel, I mean, I think of myself sometimes as a harried parent. I don't have, if I'm in the home, I mean, I'm just not going to be thinking about cookies. I'm going to just put meals on the table and stuff like that. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask what struck me as the I wanted to ask what struck me as the obvious question from this, which is what theoretical perspective helps you make sense out of all of this?
So we looked at the literature on trust and trusting. I mean, much of the trust literature looks at, I mean, when applied to technology, it's mostly used like as a functional thing, that people trusting technology is essentially the definitions equivalent of believing, I don't know, I believe this car that it's going to drive me safely straight away. Or it doesn't have to be technology. I believe that this bridge or this ceiling's not going to fall on me. So it's quite utilitarian often. But if we look at, there is a big literature in trust and distrust and how they help to manage human relationships, for example. So there is problems, insidious problems with dealing with sort of untrustworthy individuals and looking at the literature of criminal entities that have to somehow cooperate, or with medical example I gave, or there's a book by a colleague on taxi drivers. How do they pick up passengers late at night and sort of less safe locations, for example. So we were broadly informed by this was the literature we wanted to contribute to, and we were looking at how it's relevant to the interactions with technology. So, and what we've seen so far in the literature in the interactions with technology, it's mostly evoked as in this utilitarian fashion. People trust technology because they trust it to work, to do what it's promised, rather than anything else. Whereas we thought that there seems to be a dimension where technology masquerades as human-like entity, and then these other sort of findings of these relationships, where people, that's normally the domain of between human interactions and trust that come into play.
Okay, I guess I would have thought that the privacy literature would have been more directly related, given the quotes you showed us.
I'll look at that. Grant, I'll come back to you. I'll see you. Yes. Okay. Not tomorrow. Tuesday. I'll be preparing whole weekend.
I was interested in your interviews with these young college-educated women. Did you talk at all about the feminization of voice technology and how that plays into, I guess, levels of trustworthiness, but also reinforcing stereotypes about women's role in domestic labor?
I think that's a great comment. So we expected that to happen very much. So I think initially this was conceived as a kind of gender and technology perspective, because again, we know from the literature, and as I highlighted, often these things have only female voices or default female voices at the very least. And then you're right. And I think there is also literature on how people treat these things, and that it could reinforce some negative stereotypes in communication, for example. It didn't come up for us. So this was based on semi-structured interviews where we generally wanted them to talk as much as possible. So, you know, how do you use your Alexa? What do you think about Alexa? And give big open-ended questions, and then only probe if they were certain at the end whether something wasn't, we were expecting it didn't come up. So gender wasn't, I mean, they were not particularly, I think some of them said that they didn't like if their boyfriends talked badly to Alexa, but then it wasn't like the first thing. But it wasn't as important to them, it seemed.
You mentioned children as well.
Yeah.
The children seem to use these in different ways. So it obviously says a lot about our gender relationships and expectations of those relationships as much as it does about the technology.
Thank you.
We throw it all the way to Ralph at the back. Anybody on the left-hand side? That's the last question. Julia after that. And then we'll be stopped for drinks, I think.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, I was just going to follow up a little bit with Vicky, because I've started asking my phone questions. I don't know how many people do that, and a woman always answers. But I mean, how is that different? Because you know, I don't really have a problem with, you know, asking Google on my phone, you know, what's the population of Germany or something like that, and I don't really think of you know. Page and Brin or whoever runs Google nowadays kind of listening in on me. Why is that? I mean, is there a difference between, you know, the interface and the way we use the device, or is there something different going on?
That's really interesting question, and something maybe I should think more about it. I mean, my sort of gut response would be that there might be something about the domestic sphere, because many of these individuals, not all of them, but many were coupled, so they were not all single. So there was sometimes a tension with two members of the couple having very different ways, one being comfortable with this device, the other not being comfortable with the device. I think that focused the mind. In another case, I think the interviewee was single, but she lived with roommates in New York. I think they shared a flat. And she wanted to put Alexa in the kitchen and was banned from it by the roommates. So I think some of it might be just this, that there's more people involved with more different opinions. And another thing is something that Vicky mentioned, and I haven't thought about, but now I'm thinking about, is also perhaps less perceived control. Like if I ask, like with Google, for example, at some point I discovered that Google Maps was storing all kinds of information on me, like everywhere I went. And I clearly made some choice at some point saying I'm totally fine with that. and I did switch it off, and I think I erased it, who knows. But at least there was a way, like a visible way for me to find out and kind of deal with it. I wouldn't even know where to start with Alexa, something like that. I mean, I think probably eventually I hear people figure it out and look at the recordings, and I think you can request some erasure as well. But it initially feels as a more of a barrier and a difficulty, because as Vicky pointed out, we are more used to screens in a way.
Yes, my question is not on this study, but on the framing of the broader research project, if that's all right. Just I'm curious why the focus is on unpaid domestic work as opposed to paid domestic work and the effects on that.
I think both are very interesting and really relevant. And I'd love to know about paid domestic work, someone doing this research. I think in principle, paid domestic work would be part of the big literature on the future of work. It would belong there. I haven't seen much focus, cleaners are all going to lose their jobs in the near future, hasn't quite made into the news or anything big that clearly noticeable. But so I think there is a lot of still scope to do more research on paid domestic labor. But I don't think anyone's done much research at all on the unpaid domestic labor, and it has huge consequences. I didn't put this in this presentation, but sometime I'd love to show. I have graphs comparing the average times people spend on paid and unpaid work, and they're surprisingly similar. And in addition, it's shared extremely unequally. So it's a lot more gender unequal than paid labor in modern days as well. So that was the impetus.
I guess it's like say to our default students, it's not your life's work, it's your current project. Anyway, if I could just say a huge thank you, Katya, for being willing to do this tonight and sing for your supper effectively. It's just so lovely to hear about your research and to ensure that everybody knows what you're doing now that you are our newest associate professor of the OAI. Can everybody give one final round of applause?